Just as a reminder, folks, if you want to see reviews like this in an uncensored format, head over to Patreon or Subscribestar and be a supporter of this channel. You will see reviews like this a couple days early, plus in an uncensored format. And for shows like this, trust me, there's a lot that gets censored by our little army of that guys. Also, if you're new to the channel and you're a Spawn fan, I'm also an independent comic book creator, just like Todd McFarlane is, though obviously nowhere near as popular. But anyway, there will be more details on that at the end of the video, but feel free to check out the links in the description to check out what my company, Grindstone Arts, has to offer. Well, ladies and gents, since we're entering spooky month, I figured I'd start us off by talking about one of my favorite animated series of all time, Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Now you might want to ask me the question of, Micah, didn't you make a video on this already? And you would be right. I did. And for some reason I can't find it. I don't know if I deleted it or what, but I just could not find it for the life of me. Granted, it wasn't my best work. And not to mention, a lot of other content creators visit things that they've reviewed before. So I figured I'd have another look at this particular series since it actually does qualify for my disturbing animation section. Not to mention, Spawn is great for Halloween, let's just be honest. Now, I want to talk pretty in depth on this series because there's quite a few levels to it and what made it so good. However, to really set this up, we have to go into both the comic book series that it's based on and the comic book legend that created it, Todd McFarlane. Now, Todd is one of those creators that is considered a hero to a lot of people who work in independent comics like I do. Todd is one of the most prolific comic book artists ever, and he actually contributed art on two of the most legendary comic book runs of the late 80s and early 90s, working on both Peter David's run of The Incredible Hulk, and then David Michelinie's run of The Amazing Spider-Man. In fact, Todd's often considered one of the greatest Spider-Man artists of all time, and it's obvious to see why if you see his work on the character. He always put an impeccable amount of detail into Peter's costume, his movements and poses, and I was always enthralled by how he'd just take a ton of time to draw all the little details of Spider-Man's webbing. I mean, his Spider-Man solo book's #1 issue is easily one of the top 5 Spider-Man covers of all time. Also one of the best-selling ever. He also co-created a character that I would argue is now Spider-Man's most popular villain in Venom. Though the character's not really a villain anymore. Now, I know some people are going to argue that Green Goblin or Dr. Octavius are more popular villains for Spider-Man. But no, you're wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Sorry. Venom has hundreds of solo comics, with some that are freaking awesome, on top of 2 of his own movies. But anyway, Venom is a discussion for another time. Point is that Todd was a really big name in comic books because of his work on Spider-Man and Hulk. And basically had a claim to being a legend already, and he wasn't even 35 yet. Then, he left Marvel Comics to start Image Comics with Eric Larson, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Wilkie Portacio, Mark Silvestri, and Jim Valentino. It was here that Todd brought out an old concept from his high school days, and officially put the character of Spawn onto the page. Now from here, the character was a massive hit. The first issue of Spawn sold over 1 million copies, and over 30 years later, the comic is a consistent seller. Heck, I actually have a copy of the first printing of this book. It's also got a run of over 300 issues, and there's a ton of Spawn side stories. The most recommended that I could think of off the top of my head are Spawn: The Dark Ages, Curse of the Spawn, Blood Feud, which is actually written by Alan Moore, the Spawn Wildcats crossover, which is also written by Alan Moore, and then Hellspawn, a book written by Brian Michael Bendis before he lost his mind and went from being one of the best comic book writers in the world to one of the worst. I mean, he ruined Superman. How the fuck do you do that? Because Bendis. That's how. Anyway, what was I talking about? My blinding hatred for Brian Michael Bendis just sort of took over. Oh, Spawn. Anyway, Spawn as a comic book has been a comic I've enjoyed quite a bit. It always had this fun mix of superhero action and horror affectation that made it incredibly unique. Now I know that some people tend to call it 90s edgy la edge and such, but those people are just Movie Bob. And Movie Bob is stupid, and doesn't know anything about anything. This is a guy who would rather watch Scott Pilgrim, which features a character that fucking sucks and is a horrible human being, than something like The Expendables. Go fuck yourself. Anyway, anyone who has actually read this comic can tell you it's a fun romp. Not to mention, Spawn's just got one of the coolest costumes that comic books have ever seen. And Todd McFarlane's art in the early books, followed by Greg Capullo's just after him, has some of the coolest panel work and visual storytelling you're going to find. I maintain that the first 100 issues of Spawn should honestly be studied by comic book artists that are getting into it so that they can understand the unique ways to use paneling and page layout to aid the story. I mean, heck, I can't really name how many times I've actually read through these issues and taken notes on them. It's obviously one of my biggest inspirations as a comic book creator. I mean, just look at the alternate cover for Inglewood Book 2 by Preston Acevedo. After this thing got published, one of my readers actually messaged me and said, "I wish you and Preston would do Spawn at some point." Goes without saying that's a hell of a compliment, but, I mean, just like Todd McFarlane, I am a pasty white guy who decided to buck a lot of normal trends and have a story about a black superhero in the inner city. Believe it or not, when I created The Saint, there were people who actually asked me, why did you decide for your first superhero to be a black character? Now, they didn't mean anything by it. I'm not, like, trying to imply anybody's racist or something, but it's one of those things where it's just, not typical. So whenever people decide to buck the trend, some people are like, oh, interesting. And that's the way they were with Al Simmons as well. Though obviously on a much greater scale, because I'm nobody and Todd McFarlane is Todd McFarlane. Now, let's fast forward with Spawn to the year 1997. We've been about 5 years since the character's debut, and around this time there were a ton of animated series that were from both Marvel and DC Comics that were very enjoyable. Both Batman and Superman had series of their own, and on the Marvel side you had Spider-Man, the X-Men, Hulk, Fantastic Four, and Iron Man. For Image Comics, Wildcats and Savage Dragon also got animated series. Savage Dragons was actually alright. With Wildcats, the less said the better. Now, the difference between Savage Dragon, Wildcats, and Spawn is that Spawn was going to have a very different approach. Most Image Comics, if you go back and read them, they're aimed at a much more mature demographic, especially during that time Wildcats and Savage Dragon. The thing is, Savage Dragon and Wildcats were airing on cable television on a Saturday morning. The edge of the comic was gone, with those series being aimed at a much younger audience. Spawn was going to be on HBO, and was going to be just as R-rated as the comic book is.
Who is
about to take your head off?
Yeah. The first time I saw anything from this series, oddly enough, wasn't until many years after it had wrapped up. It was actually that clip that just got played. You see, at the time I was a sophomore in high school, and my dad and I had a weekly routine where we'd usually rent a movie or a game for the weekend. One of those weekends, we rented the Spawn movie, which was alright. John Leguizamo as the clown was actually pretty fucking funny at some points. But I honestly don't remember a whole lot else about it, except the actors that were in it. What really did stick with me was the trailer for the Spawn animated series that came before the movie started, which that same clip had played in. All I could really say when I saw it was, holy fuck! I'd finally get to watch the series a couple of years later. I mentioned in one of my previous videos that I kept the routine of renting a new movie or something every weekend. And over the course of a few weeks, during my long binge of discovering the adult animation section at my local video store, I say local, but I lived in a really small town. I had to go 2 towns over. But regardless, I had this streak of watching more mature animation, which is, of course, where I saw Biohunter, Genocyber, and things of that nature. And Spawn was one that they had the entire show on VHS. Yes, this was so long ago that VHS was still a thing. I am old. But anyway, I couldn't pull myself away from the series. And can you blame me? It's oftentimes considered one of the greatest animated comic series of all time. I mean, heck, it's an Emmy Award winner. Unfortunately, the season that won the Emmy was the season that HBO canceled it after. Yeah, that was a good call, wasn't it? Fucking idiots. Gee, Warner Brothers making really stupid mistakes. When have they done that before? Ezra Miller, cough, cough. Sorry. Now, before we get into the storyline of this one, I do have to talk about the elements that bring it all together. The writer for this one is Alan B. McElroy, who also wrote Halloween 4 and created the Wrong Turn franchise. He also wrote the Curse of the Spawn miniseries that I had mentioned earlier, and also wrote the Spawn film. Now, if you look at his other past writing credits, some of them admittedly suck. But I will say that McElroy's writing in this particular show is probably his best, because he does have some pretty high highs as well. And he does a really fantastic job of writing a horror-based Spawn story that's still faithful enough to the source material. Though admittedly it does start to pull away later on. As for the animation, it's fucking fantastic. McFarlane animations were pretty legendary because of this series, and for good reason. Aside from the main team, they also were backed up by Madhouse and a few other companies. A lot of the same strengths that the comic book had are just as true for the animation, in the sense that they're both excellent with visual storytelling. In the comic book medium, Spawn was always a comic that I mentioned earlier that played really well with panel layout and page layout, like I mentioned before, and how it puts panels together, being stylized with the way that the lines work, things along those lines, on top of just having great art. The animated series does really well in regards to color work and using lighting to set moods and tone properly, really giving you the right amount of detail to keep you uneasy. You see, this really isn't a superhero series. This is a horror series that just happens to be about a superhero comic that also has, of course, a lot of horror influence. Not to mention, there's a lot of strong emotional beats within the story, and all of them are put together beautifully by the animation team. This is one of those series where I'm of the opinion, if you get somebody who says that superheroes can't tell emotionally complex stories whatsoever because they've just watched the most recent cringe that the MCU just dropped, show them this series. It'll wake them the fuck up. Now, there's a criticism that I have, and it's that there tends to be some points where the animation team will loop back on stock footage or recent frames of animation instead of just animating a full sequence. Now, what I will mention is that you kind of have to be looking for this sort of thing to really notice it the first time you find it. Given that I've been a critic for as long as I've been, it wouldn't surprise me if other people don't catch this sort of thing the first time around. But it is there. Japanese anime does the same thing, with a couple of notorious examples being Gundam Wing and Gundam Seed, because they would basically reuse stock animation from earlier episodes, because you might as well get the most use out of the animation cells that you can. I don't really hold it against them, because I understand as a creator myself, sometimes you just gotta save a few dollars. At the same time, if a viewer sees that sort of thing and realizes what you're doing, it could take them out of the experience. Now, the score for this was done by Shirley Walker, who is well known for her work on Batman the Animated Series for the first couple of seasons of this, and then the third season is done by J. Peter Robinson, who did parts of Erie, Indiana, and Tales from the Crypt. The score does a really good job of having the gothic tone that really just sits in the pit of your stomach but it's not really going to elevate itself into the kind of epic superhero vibes that Batman the Animated Series would. It stays in the dark. It really services the story quite well, making each of the moments even more memorable than they were before. It's great at emphasizing shocking and even surreal moments, making sure that it aids the imagery that you're seeing, helping it to stick in your head. One particular moment I can think of is the reveal of a certain character having been assassinated, where you just see the image of him slumped over his desk with a couple of bullet holes in the back of his chair and blood trickling onto the ground, and you just hear the phone going off in the background. And then the music that hits is just impactful as to what the hell just happened and why it's significant. Without the score being there, it wouldn't hit as hard. Now, let's talk about voice acting. In the same way that the sadly departed Kevin Conroy was the voice of Batman, the incredibly talented Keith David is, by and large, the voice of Spawn.
As far as I know, I'm already dead, which means I'm waiting for your sorry ass in the afterlife.
Now, Keith David's one of my favorite actors ever. If you're an animation fan, you're going to know him as the voice of Goliath in Gargoyles, or Dr. Facilier in The Princess and the Frog. If you're a video game person, you're going to know him as the Arbiter in the Halo series, or Julius from the two good Saints Row games, and then, of course, Admiral Anderson in Mass Effect. If you're a film buff, you're going to know him from John Carpenter's They Live and The Thing. He's a ridiculously talented actor, and his depth really comes through in this. And we'll go over some individual scenes as we break down each part of the animated series. He's joined by one of his co-stars from The Thing in this particular series, with Richard Dysart playing Cagliostro. And I'm honestly glad that they picked someone that Keith David had worked with before. A lot of their scenes are really cool character developing conversations for both characters, which bring a lot of really cool intensity to the story and to both of their backstories, as they're discussing many of the issues that Spawn has. They're joined by Dominique Jennings as Wanda Blake, John Rafter Lee as Jason Wynn, Ming-Na Wen, who many of you will know as the voice of Mulan, as the series' original character Lisa Wu, Ruben Santiago Hudson as Chapel, Robert Forster as Major Forsberg, and then John DiMaggio does some various roles. You'll know him when you hear him. And then a couple of guys who steal the show are James Keane and Michael McShane. Now, both guys play two different parts each. Keane plays mob boss Antonio Twist, and Mike McShane plays the drunk bum and friend of Spawn's named Garib, who are both integral characters to the plot. However, both Keane and McShane also play the iconic detectives of Sam and Twitch, respectively. These guys are one of the most notable cop partnerships in all of comics, and they've got a really good dynamic with one another. Now, Sam Burke comes across as your typical pudgy New York cop who is brash and outspoken, but he's overall a good person who's just very devoted to his job and just doesn't take any bullshit. Then his partner Twitch is the opposite of Sam's boisterous personality, where he's a blonde, short nerd with an expansive vocabulary and ridiculous intelligence that comes across as a bit meeker. The two play off one another really well, though, because they both love being cops. They're both really good cops. They don't take BS. They know when they're being fed a lie, and they share really strong moral compasses and devotion to what they do. They're a big part of helping to move the story along, especially in bringing some of the shadow players to light. Plus, some of the conspiratorial stuff in the show is basically as much their story as it is Spawn's. Obviously, Keith David deserves a ton of praise for his part in the show, but I really feel like James Keane and Michael McShane could come along and outright steal some episodes of it. At this point, though, we really do need to talk about the plot, so there will be spoilers. I'm going to talk about the overall tone of each particular season, what happens in it, and what changes from season to season. Each one's only 6 episodes long, so you could honestly sit and watch the entire show within a day. Thing is, doing so is a little weird, because there's a couple things in season 1 that get dropped completely as the rest of the show goes on. If you don't want spoilers, go to this timestamp to avoid them. I'm also going to be putting time codes in the YouTube version of this so you guys can skip ahead to parts you might not have seen yet or easily navigate to hear my thoughts on each particular season after you've watched this. So, let's go ahead and dive in. The first season of the show begins with a couple of men walking down some alleys in New York City, talking about investigating a lead or something for a story. They meet the guy that they're supposed to talk to, who then gets a hole blown in his chest cavity in front of both of them. The assassins reveal themselves to the two men, executing one of them with a shotgun. As they begin to douse the other man in gasoline, this is where we're introduced to our hero. Spawn comes in and makes absolute mincemeat out of both men. It shows one of the most gruesome kills in the entire series right out of the gate, as Spawn basically rips a man's arm in half for the most part, and then makes him shoot himself in the head. After that, the man who's been doused in gasoline makes the mistake of getting scared and pulling the trigger on a gun to shoot Spawn, and then gets lit ablaze from the sparks. From here, Spawn has a Vietnam flashback to his death, and a lot of this first episode revolves around him trying to piece together exactly what happened to him. Spawn himself is a former American soldier turned assassin named Al Simmons. He was betrayed on a mission, and because of his evil ways in life, he was sent to hell. He made a deal with a demon called Malbolgia to get his life back, but in the agreement, it's one where you have to realize that Malbolgia is choosing his words very carefully. He said, "You'd get to see your wife Wanda again." The thing is, he didn't specify that you'd wake up 5 years later and Wanda's now married to your best bro, has a kid with him, and you look like this. Yeah, not a happy thing. Let's put the mask back on, shall we? By the way, I should mention this, that if you really like Spawn's costume as much as I do, the first season is actually the most you see of it. They obscure Spawn in shadow a lot. I think mostly just for cost-cutting reasons. But this doesn't add a neat effect of him feeling like he's part of the shadows themselves. Anyway, as the plot in the first season goes forward, we have 3 plot lines. The first is Spawn and his issues in the alley, which include mob cyber hitman Overkill and Clown, also known as the Violator, who is meant to keep Spawn on the crooked and awful. And he does so with extreme prejudice. The second is the murder mystery of who the hell ordered the killings on the guys in the alley. The third is why they were killed, and the significance of a government cover-up that murder was one part of. Spawn's story largely revolves around him trying to figure himself out, all while dealing with the fallout of the assassins that he killed at the start. And then, of course, the other mob members he took out after that. You see, the killers work for a mob boss known as Antonio Twistelli, or Tony Twist for short, who is one to hold a grudge, which is why after his assassins get killed, he keeps trying to send people into the alley to kill Spawn, and even Overkill, though he has some success in the first fight. Well, this happens to him when the second one comes around. I guess Spawn really came from the school of when some other mother hubber is wanting to tear you a structurally superfluous new behind, use a gun. Yeah, he's definitely a TF2 engineer player. Anyway, Tony Twist's guys were actually hired by Jason Wynn, who is the head of a shadowy government organization that specializes in assassination. Wow, that's not really specific to anything, is it? That could kind of be anyway. Well, he's also corrupt. And that's even less specific. But he's a government employee so it kind of goes with the territory. In reality, he's the head of the NSC, the National Security Council, and has ties to the CIA and a bunch of other organizations. Very powerful guy. Anyway, the assassination of the 2 guys at the beginning was Jason Wynn killing 2 reporters that were about to drop a dime on something horrendous. The government also tries to frame a former child rapist named Kyle Watson as the perp for these horrendous acts, where children are being raped and then murdered in Spawn's alley. Now, the person defending Kyle Watson is Wanda Blake, and she realizes in talking to Kyle that he is on a prescription that would keep him from being able to sexually assault the little girls that died, essentially ruling him out as the potential killer, even though there was evidence planted in his room. And then over on the NYPD investigating the murders are Sam and Twitch. Essentially, both of them are looking at one half each of what exactly this whole cover-up entails. You see, what Jason Wynn is basically doing here is pulling a favor for a Senator McMillan, who has a bastard son named Billy Kincaid, a child rapist and serial killer. Wynn wants to put McMillan in the White House so he'd have control over a president, and Billy is the one big sticking point, but also the one big skeleton in the senator's closet that Wynn can use to basically keep control, which of course aids Wynn's side hustle, where he illegally sells American weaponry and technology to other nations. You can see why I'd like to do a deep dive of this, like episode by episode at some point, because there's a lot of little details in the first season that really make for compelling storytelling. Anyway, the whole thing comes together at the end when Spawn finds out that Billy has actually kidnapped Cyan, Wanda's daughter. The devil on Spawn's shoulder, Clown, arranged the whole thing because Clown's an asshole and probably thought it would be hilarious. Okay, actually that's not true. He wants Spawn to kill Billy because he knows it'll turn Spawn to the dark side permanently, getting rid of any source of humanity still left in him. The last episode of the season is fucking tense. In fact, I'd say it's one of the most tense moments in television history, but also includes two of my favorite lines in the whole series, one from Sam and one from Spawn. The first is this great briefing from Sam Burke.
Now, God be with you, gentlemen, and kick ass out.
The second is this great delivery when Spawn's just trying to kick Billy Kincaid's ass.
Come in, that bastard.
The whole thing ends with Spawn catching Kincaid, saving Cyan, but deciding not to kill Billy. Instead, he drops Billy on his head really fucking hard, almost like he's John Moxley wrestling a luchador. Thing is, this particular event isn't celebrated with Tony Khan humping the air like John Moxley's concussion was. Rather, Clown shoots Billy in the face with a .357 snub nose, putting him out of his misery. As for Al and Cyan, they share a great moment together, and if you don't find Cyan reuniting with Terry and Wanda as moving, you might want to go to church and pray, because you don't have a fucking soul. So that's Season 1. A beautifully wonderful story that ties together three plots very tightly, and really is a good example of how to balance three parallel storylines with one another. There's a lot of writers these days that should watch the first season and take notes. I sure as hell do anytime I dive into this thing. The second season of the show is just called Todd McFarlane's Spawn 2, but I prefer to title it Terry Fitzgerald Has a Really Bad Fucking Day. I've seen a few people here and there say that this is the weakest of the three seasons, and I can understand why they would say that. This is easily the season with the least amount of plotting and intrigue in it, but it's not weak on plot. Not to mention, the extra layers of storylines and things like that get traded out for a lot of really good focused character development, a lot of really good atmosphere, and a much better understanding of Al Simmons as a person. The whole thing starts out with Spawn being hunted in the alleys by a former partner of his from his military days and assassin days named Chapel. Now, Chapel actually gets seen in the first season, but a lot of his appearances were merely to show that Jason Wynn had another assassin working for him, and that person was the person who killed Spawn in his past life. Now, for those of you who may have read more recent comic books like King Spawn, you might be a little confused by this because more modern comics state that Al Simmons was killed by Jessica Priest, who is a character that was, I believe, first introduced in the film. Now, that's a retcon, because Jessica Priest is a character that Todd McFarlane actually owns. In the comics, Chapel is actually a creation of former X-Force artist and Deadpool co-creator Rob Liefeld. Now, at this point, Todd was able to use the character of Chapel, but at some point, Rob Liefeld lost the rights to Youngblood, which is the superhero team, and I use superhero in air quotes, that Chapel was a part of, and things had to get switched around in the official continuity. Honestly, there's a lot of that in Spawn if you go reading the comics. There's sort of a weird theology to them where both heaven and hell are assholes, and that actually kind of gets switched a bit to something that's a little bit more traditionally Judeo-Christian, in the sense that God good, Satan bad, Spawn just doesn't like anybody. But regardless, that's a whole discussion for another time. Back to Chapel. Since Todd was still able to use the character at the time of the show, that's who we get. So Chapel is sent into Spawn's alleys to look for the weaponry that Spawn had stolen in the first season to take out Overkill. What's really great about this whole character sequence between the two is the dialogue between Spawn and Chapel actually pulls a lot from the comics. In fact, the Don Juan of Killers line is directly lifted from their confrontation within the comic book. Now, as you can imagine, as this whole process is going on and Chapel is trying to fight Spawn and failing at it, he starts to lose what little grip he had on reality from beforehand, and this revelation that Spawn indeed is Al Simmons pushes him over the edge.
They're coming back. Get there, Mike. Look, they're coming back.
Now from here, the story largely starts to follow Terry Fitzgerald. In the first season, Terry had found out that there were some shipping discrepancies in certain weapons from the National Security Council that had gone missing. Now, Terry originally figured that the person responsible for it was likely the same person who stole them from the warehouse to kill Overkill. Now, the thing is, in Season 2, Terry gets a bit more curious, and Jason Wynn decides to get rid of him because he's becoming a problem who is digging into the fact that Jason is making black market arms sales with United States military tech. From here, Terry has to find himself running away from assassins. At the same time, Clown starts screwing Spawn's mind to try to convince him that Terry always wanted him dead. Well, Spawn realizes that he wants the truth, so he decides to kill the assassins so that if Terry needs to die, he's the one who does it. At that point, after most of the assassins are dead, he reads Terry's mind, because that's the thing he can do, and realizes that Terry actually really cared about him and was truly the closest friend a man could really ever ask for. The ending of this particular episode is very visually appealing, with Spawn choking a man to death surrounded by flames, but there's also this really wholesome moment where Terry is talking to Al at Al's grave, swearing that he'll always take care of Al's family. It's a very touching moment and really shows some of the more grounded and heart-wrenching elements of this series. The next couple of episodes basically exist to show Spawn killing people that nobody likes. There's one episode where he ends up killing a semi-satanic something or other of a gang that's selling drugs in the alleys, and these particular gangsters happen to murder a couple of the bums there that Spawn, well, didn't want murdered. The death sequence at the end of these fucking drug-peddling assholes is one of my favorites in the entire series, and it's really something to watch, because it honestly shows how effective Spawn is as a horror character. The next episode after this is just Terry Fitzgerald having an even worse day, because he gets caught by a racist serial killer who is getting visions of the KKK burning people alive that are being sent to him by Malvolja, which is actually something that gets completely name-dropped. Now, Terry manages to escape, and the killer, well, gets killed by Spawn. It's a really grotesque episode, which I'm all for, but it's a little heavier on imagery and honestly a little lighter on story. The last couple of episodes start to transition into a final confrontation between Jason Wynn and Spawn, but also shows a journalist character named Lisa Wu, who has some supernatural element to her that's not really spilled out in the season. But either way, she is investigating the alleyway murders for the Washington Post, the same newspaper that the journalists from Season 1 were at. There's also a really cool sequence where one of Jason Wynn's assassins is about to kill Wanda Blake, and Spawn just fucking destroys him by snapping him in half. This sequence also has this really cool moment where Cyan shows up after Wanda starts screaming her head off at what she just saw. Understandably, I mean, she just saw a man get broken in half right in front of her. Well, Cyan's not scared of Spawn at all, because she knows who he is. And when Spawn leaves, there's another one of those soul-rending moments that start to help Wanda put together the fact that Spawn is actually her husband. I mean, her her first husband, the crispy one. Anyway, Spawn goes and makes mincemeat out of most of Jason Wynn's forces after this, but he ends up heeding the warnings of Cagliostro earlier in the story, where he was warned that if Jason Wynn is killed, he'll likely come back with the same powers that Spawn has as well. At the end of it, Spawn no longer dismisses Cagliostro as some bum, spares Jason Wynn's life, and realizes that the old man knows quite a bit about his predicament, to the point where he really needs to investigate what the hell is truly going on here. Pun totally intended. Now, like I mentioned, it's not as complex of a storyline as the first season, but at the same time I feel like this particular season had a much stronger atmosphere on top of an actual setup of whether or not Spawn was actually going to kill Jason Wynn and how that conflict was going to shake out. I mean, up to this point we've seen Spawn shed blood without much issue. He destroyed Overkill, killed several of Tony Twist's goons, and it's implied that he actually killed Tony Twist as well, though we never get confirmation of it. At the same time, he also spared Chapel, and spared Billy Kincaid. But there's still a good amount of suspense, because you know what Spawn is capable of. It's not out of his league to just, rip people to pieces. So it's more suspenseful than if, let's say, Spider-Man was in a similar scenario, where you're wondering whether or not he's going to kill somebody. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the third and final season. Now, if you're missing the density that we got from the first season after watching Season 2, they bring it back in Season 3. However, I do need to mention a retcon that's in this. In Season 1, they showed the character of Angela from the comics, who at the time was owned by Neil Gaiman. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if this was around the time that Neil and Todd were starting to have a falling out, because the character of Lisa Wu is basically here to substitute for Angela. For those who don't know, Neil Gaiman would later sell the character of Angela to Marvel Comics, where she would get folded into Thor's mythos of all things, and get forever lampooned for the whole unsolicited opinions about Israel page. Nice job, Neil. You sold a character that was actually interesting to a terrible company, ran by terrible people, that turned her into a fucking joke. Congratulations, dude! Then again, what should I expect from somebody that's as overrated as Neil Gaiman is? When it comes to British comic book writers, Alan Moore is better, Warren Ellis is better, and other guys from that region like Grant Morrison, Garth Ennis, and others are better as well. He's fucking overrated, man. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Spawn the Animated Series, which is better than Netflix's Sandman because Todd actually gives a fuck about the comic book being properly represented in the series based on the source material. Have I mentioned I really don't like Neil Gaiman very much? Anyway, now that I'm done being bitter and petty, we have the character of Lisa Wu, like I mentioned, who is also known as Jade. Now, she is a former lover of Genghis Khan, but more importantly, she's a bounty hunter who specializes in hunting Hellspawn. The plot is going to follow her, Spawn, and our good buddies, Sam and Twitch, once again. The overall plot to this one has to do with Sam and Twitch getting a little too close to the truth in regards to Jason Wynn and his connections to the Alley murders. Plus, we have Spawn trying to get his humanity back, and setting up the fact that Heaven and Hell are both looking to take Spawn out because of how he might affect the world going forward. One of my favorite sequences from the first couple episodes is actually when we see Twitch meet Spawn. The conversation that the two have is to confirm that Chapel is involved in some of the murders in the Alley, and it's really, really good dialogue. This is what I mean by Michael McShane putting on a performance that, in my opinion, is just as good as Keith David's. The two play so well off of one another, and the final line that gets dropped by Spawn is just fucking chilling. Don't believe me? Have a look for yourself.
When you play with matches, you can get burned.
After Twitch learns too much about what's going on here, his boss, who is a corrupt police officer in the pocket of Jason Wynn, named Chief Banks, tries to murder Twitch and then pin it on Spawn. From here on in, Twitch has some pretty impressive plot armor, I'm not gonna lie, because they keep trying to kill the guy and he just keeps going. The next couple of episodes are a bit wild because they include Spawn learning that he can shapeshift back into a human form. The first part has him visiting his former mother-in-law, Granny Blake, in a great conversation that really shows that Al is trying to be a good man, despite all the insanity that's going on around him. And Granny Blake, of course, having known him for as long as she has, knows that despite all of the violence, despite all of the killing that he's done, he's not a bad person. He's just hurt. Granny Blake, by the way, is voiced by Debbie Morgan, who is actually the very first black actress to win a Daytime Emmy for her role on All My Children. So she's actually a historic figure as far as black actors and actresses go. Back to Spawn, his second use of his human form wasn't nearly as wholesome. He impersonates Terry and goes into his house to clap Wanda's cheeks. No, I'm not kidding. Come on, Al! She's hot, yeah, but you're dead. You can't just unwittingly turn a woman into a necrophiliac. What the fuck is wrong with you? Cogliostro is just as pissed as I am, because he knows of a prophecy that talks about the child of a hellspawn being a figure that would determine how Armageddon would play out. This means that the child would either swing things into the favor of heaven or the favor of hell and end the war forever, along with the rest of the fucking planet. Nice job, Al. You fucked up by getting your crispy dick wet. Was the booty that good? Was it really? Booty so good that you want to create a situation that starts Armageddon. Anyway, speaking of the dead, another hunter that gets sent after Spawn is named Lily, who is a vampire. Yeah, this character is just a one-off that shows that Heaven's getting really desperate to kill our favorite deep-fried hero. Jade shows up after the fight is over and actually spares Spawn as he's very badly wounded, saying that she wants him to be strong when they finally fight. However, her handler, Zhang Lao, hints that something else is going on there. The other part of Spawn's story in this season has to do with one of his mentors, Major Forsberg. You see, Cogliostro and Spawn are consistently clashing, and Cogliostro wonders if there's anybody that Spawn actually respects, and Forsberg is the person that he names. Now, Forsberg at one point actually helped him keep his sanity during some of the darker moments of Al's soldiering days, though his attempts had varying results. Regardless, he's someone that Al trusts, but he finds out that he's being imprisoned by Jason Wynn after Al went into the jungle to find that the Major had left the military, betrayed Jason Wynn to protect a certain mask. More on that later. Regardless of all that, he's someone that Al Simmons trusts, but he finds out that after he brought the Major back to the States, Jason Wynn imprisoned him. At this point, Jason has lost his position at the NSC because Terry became a whistleblower. The thing is, Wynn still has enough underground connections to keep himself in a powerful position. Still, the situation with Spawn has him mentally rocked, and Jason Wynn is looking for something to even the odds. And one thing that he's looking for, and has looked for in the past, was a relic of great power, which was the war mask of Genghis Khan, rumored to contain the powers of hell. This, of course, is the same Genghis Khan that Jade decapitated while she was riding him like...
Insert mom joke here.
Also, I've heard of getting your brains fucked out, but this is a little too literal for me personally. I mean, I might have a thing for Asian women, but this just kind of shows you don't date yanderes. Anyway, Jason's underground contacts in the Triad help him hunt down the man that Major Forsberg said now has the mask, the aforementioned Zhang Lao. More on that in a bit. Terry is back, and we find that this entire time he's been hunting down Jason Wynn. He tries to assassinate him while being dressed as a bum, but he fails at it. He's put into an opium den as punishment, and he's likely going to chase Dragon for the rest of his days. At this point, Jason and a couple of escorts from the Triad head to the guy who has the mask, who I had mentioned is Zhang Lao. But for some reason, and I thought of this while I was writing the script, I always thought his name was Lo Wang, and I just remembered that Lo Wang, while I was writing this script, is actually the character from Shadow Warrior. It turns out that Zhang Lao is a very powerful man, which is why he gives the bounty hunters assignments, because he's basically a witch, like Jason Wynn was warned. So the escorts die rather pathetically. Now, even after seeing this, Jason Wynn tries to put on the mask of Genghis Khan, but the hellish powers that are within the mask are just too much for him to handle, with Zhang Lao telling him that he doesn't have the wisdom to use the mask. This, of course, deforms him quite badly. Now, at this point, a couple of rescues are going on. The first is Spawn trying to get the Major back. The second is Wanda trying to save her husband. Now, there's levels of success here, as the Major snaps back to his senses to guide Wanda and Terry out of the building, since Wanda couldn't get Terry out before, though she made a pretty valiant effort and had a really good bitch slap on a hoe. Now, it was Spawn who, of course, sprung the Major, and he instructs the Major to get the two out of the building because he's going to try and kill Wynn for imprisoning Wanda, etc., because this is going too far. Well, he has to disguise himself as Terry to get close to him. Now, the problem with this is that shifting into a human actually makes Spawn really, really vulnerable, which is something that Cagliostro had warned him of before, and some members of the Triad start turning Spawn into Swiss cheese after he's unable to kill Jason Wynn. At this point, Jade shows up, and you start to think, oh shit, Spawn's dead. That's not good. But instead, Jade spares him. Instead, she turns the guys trying to kill him into sashimi and gets him out of there. You see, as this all goes on, the thing that Zhang Lao hinted at was very true. Jade has realized that Spawn, Al Simmons, he's not evil. Not really. He's just a killer. He's just somebody that has these instincts that are bred into him because he was an assassin. She's realized that he's trying to become something more than what he is, and she's fallen in love with him. Now this brings us to the end of the story. Jade, sadly, while talking to Al at his grave, gets mortally wounded by Heaven's hunters, forcing Spawn to kill her so she won't descend to hell. Sam and Twitch confront Chief Banks in the subway once they figure out it was actually Banks who tried to kill Twitch. Now, I'm not going to tell you about the sequence on that one, and there's a reason I've been kind of mum's the word about all the little details within that plot line, because you really need to see it for itself, because in my opinion, it's the best part of this season. Sam and Twitch are awesome, seriously. At the end of all of this, though, after Jade's death, after Chief Banks gets his comeuppance, we bring this series to a close. Spawn has realized that everything that he is, both as a hellspawn and as a killer, isn't what he wants to be. He humbly goes back to Cagliostro and drops this following line.
I want my humanity back.
Then the show got canceled because we're not allowed to have nice things. Okay, we've been going at this for a while. To close this out, this is one of the biggest cliffhangers in all of animation. We're likely never going to find out what was going to happen next, though Keith David has flat out said that he'd love the chance to voice Spawn again. Todd did have a continuation planned called Spawn the Animation, and the teaser looked really interesting. The problem is that Todd apparently wanted to push the animation further than it currently was, and the whole thing ended up getting canceled. It sucks, but at the same time I do hold out hope that there could be a continuation at some point if Todd pursues it. I mean, people are still interested in Spawn. People still like the character. He still has a following to this very day. Not to mention, Image Comics has had a couple of series that they publish be very successful with television and streaming. I mean, The Walking Dead is an Image comic, and it is incredibly successful on the television realm. On top of that, Invincible over on Amazon got an animated series, and it's ridiculously popular, with Omni-Man getting ready to show up in the new Mortal Kombat game. Speaking of Image characters being in Mortal Kombat, we'll get to Spawn in a second, because he preceded Omni-Man there. But I honestly think that if Todd tried to shop something around again, he'd probably get a good chunk of the old team together to bring this story to a close. But we'll have to see what happens. You could also bring it to a close in a video game as well, which I would be all for, provided it gets the right developer. Even so, when it comes to Spawn, though I have my opinions on Mortal Kombat 11, basically it just being not as good as Mortal Kombat 10 was, the portrayal of the character of Spawn in that game was very true to the comics, and I had more fun playing him than anybody else. Not to mention, we got to have Keith David return as Spawn for it as well. Plus, given the roster of the game, you get to see the novelty of Spawn interacting with John Rambo, RoboCop, and the Terminator. Then you get to have him kill Joker, which is always great.
No more jokes. No more laughs.
Sounds like you've got a case of the grumps.
I fucking hate clowns.
Either way, this series is awesome for Halloween viewing. It's dark, it's violent, but it has a ton of heart to it. It was obviously done with a lot of love, a lot of passion, and a lot of respect for the character and his series, and hopefully someday we'll get to see this whole thing finished. On that note, guys, if you dig this video, don't forget to follow the links in the description to support my comic book label, Grindstone Arts, where we've got some great books on the way. Human Shield and the crossover between the Saint and Peregrine both have mailing lists up, plus 3 Nights, 4 Days and my novella American Monsters are still taking pre-orders. If you want to support the channel, feel free to check out the Patreon and subscribe star links below. My name is Micah Curtis, and I'll see you guys next time.